Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, today we're going to be tackling a question that has puzzled people for ages really. Was Jesus a prophet or was he God?
Yeah.
We've got some really fascinating sources to kind of explore this with us today.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got articles like a reassessment of Jesus' divinity and Jesus prophet, not God, and even a YouTube video that we dug up featuring a former Christian who now believes that Jesus was a prophet.
Wow.
So buckle up, folks. This is going to be a thought-provoking ride.
It is a question that gets right to the heart of how we interpret religious texts and historical figures.
Exactly. And you know what's so interesting is that all of our sources today, all of them, really emphasize this need to kind of approach this question with a fresh perspective.
Right.
Like they're encouraging us to set aside any preconceived notions that we might have and read the Bible as if for the first time.
It's such a crucial point, isn't it? It's about minimizing confirmation bias. That tendency to, gravitate toward information that simply reinforces what we already believe.
Yeah.
If we want to truly analyze the evidence and consider different interpretations, we need to be willing to question our own assumptions.
So let's dive right in. One of the most well-known parts of Jesus' story is, of course, the miracle of his birth.
Right.
Our sources do acknowledge this miracle.
Yeah.
Say, yeah, okay, this was a miracle. But they argue that a miraculous birth doesn't automatically equal divinity.
Okay.
They even draw a parallel to the creation of Adam and Eve. Another, miraculous birth in a sense, but that doesn't make Adam and Eve divine.
Exactly. It's all about context, right? These sources are pointing out that miracles occur in various religions, and their interpretations vary widely. What's fascinating to me is how they use the example of Adam and Eve to really challenge this assumption that Jesus' miraculous birth is just irrefutable proof of his divinity. They're urging us to consider other possibilities, to look beyond that surface level.
Yeah, it really makes you think. Okay, so moving on from birth.
Yeah.
Our sources then focus on the very human aspects of Jesus' life.
Okay.
They point out how, he ate, he slept, he felt emotions like fear and temptation.
Right.
Things that we all experience.
Absolutely.
They even highlight his prayers to God in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah.
Like, if he was God,
yeah,
why would he need to pray?
It's a really intriguing question. The sources use these examples to kind of suggest that, well, perhaps the concept of Jesus as God incarnate might not align with these very human displays of vulnerability.
Right.
They're not denying the significance of his actions,
Yeah.
but they're prompting us to reconsider maybe some traditional interpretations.
It really challenges, I have to say, the way that I've always thought about it.
Yeah.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like, if he was God, he wouldn't need an angel to come down and strengthen him.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the line of reasoning they're presenting, essentially suggesting that these human experiences, particularly moments of weakness or reliance on God, might point to a different understanding of Jesus's nature.
Okay, so now let's talk about miracles. Our sources acknowledge that Jesus performed these miraculous deeds.
Yeah.
They say, yeah, okay, but they argue that these acts are more indicative of being a prophet rather than being God.
Okay.
And they bring up examples of other prophets, like Moses parting the Red Sea, Elisha, whose bones revived a dead army.
Right. They're emphasizing that this ability to perform miracles isn't unique to Jesus in religious texts. It's a common thread in stories of prophets. What I find interesting is they dig deeper, they go further, and they point out that Jesus himself actually attributed his miracles to God's power and not his own.
That's right. There's that story of Lazarus being raised from the dead, where Jesus specifically thanks God for granting him the power to do so.
Exactly. They use this example to suggest that even within the Bible, right, there's evidence that Jesus might not have been claiming sole responsibility for these extraordinary feats.
Right.
He's acknowledging a higher power at work, which again, challenges that traditional view of him as God incarnate.
Now, here's where things get really fascinating, okay?
Okay.
Our sources delves into how Jesus never explicitly claimed to be God. They're saying you won't find in the Bible, direct statements where he's like, I am God or worship me.
Right.
Instead, they point to quotes where Jesus refers to himself as, a man or a servant of God. And he even says things like, my Father is greater than I.
Yeah. It's a compelling point, isn't it? I mean, if the concept of Jesus as God is so central to Christianity, why didn't he explicitly declare it?
Yeah.
This absence, they argue, could potentially point to a different understanding of his identity.
it really makes you think. I mean, if you were starting a new religion and you were claiming to be God, it just seems like a pretty crucial thing to tell your followers.
I see what you mean.
Right.
The sources are urging us to consider the implications of these missing declarations.
Yeah.
And what they might reveal about the original message of Jesus.
Now, there's one phrase that often comes up in these discussions. I and the Father are one.
Yes.
How do our sources address this?
They acknowledge that a lot of Christians will often interpret that phrase as proof of Jesus's divinity.
Yeah.
His unity with God the Father.
Mm.
But they offer some alternative interpretations that are worth considering.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more. What kind of alternative interpretations are we talking about?
Well, they suggest that maybe this phrase, I and the Father are one, simply indicates a unity of purpose or shared authority.
Okay.
Like imagine, two people working so closely together that they kind of become one in their goals and their actions, but they're not literally the same person, right? They apply that concept to the relationship between Jesus and God, suggesting that it might be more about a shared mission than an inherent oneness of being.
So it's kind of like looking beyond that surface level interpretation and considering the nuances of language and context.
Exactly. And that's one of the main points that our sources are driving at.
Yeah.
Context and interpretation are absolutely crucial when we're dealing with religious texts, especially ones as complex and layered as the Bible.
Okay, so another point that the sources raise is that the people who actually witnessed Jesus's miracles, they didn't call him God.
Right.
They cite examples from the Gospels where people are reacting to his miracles by saying things like, he's a great prophet, or God has visited his people, but never outright saying, you are God.
That's right. They're suggesting that people, even those who saw Jesus's extraordinary abilities firsthand, seem to view him more as a remarkable messenger or, a representative of God, but not God himself.
Which is interesting because it suggests that even during Jesus's lifetime, there might have been different interpretations of his identity kind of circulating, right?
Precisely. And it highlights the importance of understanding the historical and social context of the time and how those factors might have influenced people's understanding of who Jesus was.
Okay, so let's tackle another big one, shall we? The resurrection.
Right.
Our sources acknowledge that Jesus was raised from the dead.
Yeah.
They say, yep, that happened. But they don't believe it automatically proves his divinity.
Okay.
So what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, their argument kind of hinges on the fact that, according to the Bible, it was God who resurrected Jesus, not Jesus himself.
Okay.
They even pull a quote from the book of Acts that states that God raised him from the dead, emphasizing that God is the one performing the act.
So are they essentially separating the act of resurrection from Jesus's inherent power?
Exactly. They're prompting us to ask, if God can resurrect people, why couldn't he resurrect his chosen prophet? Does that automatically make the prophet God? They're challenging the traditional interpretation by introducing a different perspective.
Okay, before we go any further, I'm curious. How do our sources actually use the Quran to support their argument?
It's fascinating, actually. They focus on how the Quran describes Jesus as the Word and the Spirit of God. They argue that these titles highlight Jesus's unique status as a prophet, a very important prophet, but don't necessarily equate to him being God himself.
So even in Islamic tradition, which acknowledges Jesus as a significant figure, he's still distinct from God.
That's exactly their point. They highlight the Quran's explicit rejection of the Trinity, for example, and the idea of God having a son. This is key because it demonstrates how another major world religion views Jesus differently than, let's say, the traditional Christian understanding.
Now, the YouTube source that we found brings up one last point that I found really interesting.
Okay.
He suggests that the idea of Jesus's divinity was influenced by Roman idolatry.
Oh, wow.
Tell me more about that.
It's a bold claim for sure. He argues that early Christianity, as it spread through the Roman Empire, might have, absorbed some concepts from the surrounding Roman culture. Remember, the idea of human gods and demigods was quite common in Roman society.
That's true. He even compares Jesus being the Son of God in Christianity to figures like Heracles, the son of Zeus, from Greek mythology.
Exactly. It's a thought-provoking argument, forcing us to consider how cultural and historical context can influence the development of religious beliefs. It suggests that Christianity might not be a pure, untouched lineage from the teachings of Jesus, but potentially a fusion of different cultural and religious influences.
Wow, that's a lot to process. It's amazing how much ground we've covered already.
I know.
There's so much more to explore. But we'll have to continue this deep dive in the next part. So stay tuned. Welcome back. So we've been unpacking these sources that are really challenging this traditional view of Jesus as God, making this compelling case for him being a prophet instead. But, it's like a puzzle.
Right.
All these pieces, all these arguments, and we're trying to fit them all together.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. And one of the pieces that the YouTube source kind of points out is how the Bible itself might actually downplay Jesus's divinity. He argues that if Jesus truly believed he was God, and he wanted his followers to believe that, well, wouldn't that be, a major focus of his teachings?
That makes sense. It's almost like if you're starting a new religion and you're claiming to be God. I mean, wouldn't you want to shout from the rooftops?
Yeah, exactly.
But the sources are pointing out that, Jesus never even instructed his followers to worship him.
Precisely. They're saying, show me where in the Bible, Jesus commands people to worship him as God. If that was truly his intention, it seems like a pretty crucial instruction to leave out. Instead, they highlight how the Bible seems to emphasize, other aspects.
Right.
Even seemingly trivial details at times.
Oh, I remember that. He talks about how the Bible goes into great detail about things like Paul's cloak, but doesn't spend as much time explicitly stating Jesus's divinity.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. He's essentially questioning the Bible's priorities if the goal was to really establish Jesus as God. And this ties back to the source's overall argument. We need to approach the Bible with an open mind, looking for what it actually says rather than reading into it based on our own pre-existing beliefs.
So it's not just about what's said, but also about what's not said.
Okay, so let's get into some of the more theological arguments that the sources kind of unpack here.
Okay.
They seem to have a problem with certain concepts, like the Trinity, for example. The idea that God exists as three co-equal persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Right. They argue that the Trinity, while a core concept in, Christianity, it's not something that is explicitly spelled out in the Bible. It's more about church tradition and interpretation that kind of evolved over time.
So how do they explain, then, the idea of Jesus having, both human and divine natures? Because that seems pretty central to the concept of the Trinity.
Well, they use some complex theological terms to explain this, honestly. But essentially what they're saying is that the idea of Jesus as an incarnate God, possessing both human and divine natures at the same time, it's a theological construct that was developed by the church long after Jesus actually lived.
So it's it's almost like they're saying these ideas are more like add-ons to the original story.
Yeah.
Attempts to explain something that wasn't necessarily there in the beginning.
That's one way to look at it, for sure. They're challenging that assumption that these later interpretations, are the only valid way to understand the story of Jesus. They encourage us to question, where these ideas came from and how they might have evolved over time.
Okay, I'm starting to see how they're kind of piecing together this argument.
Yeah.
But it's also clear that both sources lean heavily on the Quran to support their view of Jesus as a prophet. So why is that?
Well, the Quran actually provides a very different perspective on Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And they cite specific verses that emphasize Jesus's, miraculous birth, but they frame it within the context of him being a messenger of God, not God himself. They also highlight how the Quran explicitly rejects the concept of the Trinity and the idea that God has a son.
So basically they're saying, look, even another major world religion views Jesus differently.
Right, exactly.
And if I remember correctly, doesn't the Quran actually state that believing that Jesus is God is blasphemous?
That's a key point. They're using the Quran not only to support their own interpretation of Jesus, but also to demonstrate how another major religion offers a completely different understanding of this, really pivotal figure.
This is all really fascinating. It's amazing how these sources weave together biblical analysis, historical context, and even insights from the Quran.
It's pretty amazing.
But I'm curious, how do they explain, then, the development of this concept of Jesus as God if he never explicitly claimed it?
Well, that's where their critique of the church comes in.
Yeah.
They argue that the church played a significant role in, shaping how we understand Jesus today.
Yeah.
And that some of those interpretations might not be directly supported by the Bible itself.
So are they saying that the church essentially rewrote the story of Jesus?
Well, not exactly rewrote, maybe reinterpreted is a better word.
Okay.
They point out how, as Christianity spread and evolved, certain doctrines and interpretations kind of emerged that might have moved away from the original message.
That makes sense. It's like a game of telephone, right, where the message changes a little with each retelling.
Right.
So how does this relate to the concept of Jesus as God?
Well, they believe that the idea of Jesus' divinity might be one of those concepts that evolved over time, influenced by various factors, including the surrounding culture.
So they're suggesting that what we know as Christianity now is kind of like a product of its time.
Yeah.
Shaped by both internal and external influences.
Precisely. They argue that, to truly understand Jesus, we need to consider the historical and social context in which Christianity developed.
Right.
Including, the influence of the Roman Empire.
Speaking of the Roman Empire, the YouTube source makes a pretty bold claim about how Roman idolatry might have actually influenced early Christianity. Can you remind me what he said?
Sure. He argued that as Christianity gained popularity within the Roman Empire, it might have kind of absorbed some of the prevailing pagan beliefs and practices, including this idea of human gods. He even draws a parallel between Jesus being the Son of God in Christianity to figures like Heracles, who was considered the son of Zeus in Greek mythology.
It's definitely a controversial claim, but it's interesting to think about how, cultural and historical contexts might have shaped religious beliefs in maybe like unexpected ways.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to consider that the development of religious beliefs is often complex, with various influences kind of shaping and reshaping that narrative over time.
We've covered so much ground already.
I know, right?
But it feels like there's still so much more to explore. What other intriguing arguments do these sources present?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the question, was Jesus a prophet or God?
Yeah.
We've been analyzing some pretty thought-provoking sources that challenge, the traditional Christian view.
Right.
And it's amazing how many different layers there are to this story.
It really highlights how crucial it is to look beyond simple answers and really delve into nuances of history, culture, and religious texts. Right. And these sources don't shy away from pointing out how the church has played a significant role, in shaping how we understand Jesus, for better or for worse.
Right.
They're particularly critical of what they perceive as the church's tendency to kind of impose doctrines and interpretations that aren't necessarily explicitly supported by the Bible.
Yeah.
Like those complex theological terms we were talking about earlier.
Yes, exactly. Terms like nasut, lahut, and aquanim, they argue that those concepts were developed, long after Jesus's time and might be more about human attempts to, reconcile seemingly contradictory aspects of Jesus than about his original message.
So it's like, are they saying that sometimes it's okay to embrace the mystery?
Yeah.
To acknowledge that we might not have all the answers when it comes to the nature of God?
That's a great way to put it. They're advocating for a sense of humility in the face of the unknown. A willingness to acknowledge that, our understanding of these really profound concepts might be limited.
Now the YouTube source, he's particularly vocal in his critique of the church.
Yeah.
He even goes so far as to say that Christianity was, corrupted by Roman idolatry.
Wow.
I mean, that's a pretty bold statement to make.
It certainly is. He suggests that as Christianity gained, traction within the Roman Empire, that it absorbed some of the surrounding pagan beliefs and practices, including this idea of human gods, which was already prevalent in Roman culture. He even draws parallels between Jesus and, and mythological figures like Heracles, who was considered the son of Zeus in Greek mythology.
So he's basically arguing that what we know today as Christianity might not be, a pure direct lineage from the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah.
But rather a fusion of different cultural and religious influences.
Precisely. It's a complex and potentially controversial argument, but it forces us to think critically about how religious beliefs evolve over time.
Right.
It's rarely a clean, straight line from a founder's original teachings to a codified set of doctrines.
So after all this deep diving, what are the key takeaways?
Yeah.
Where do these sources ultimately kind of leave us in our understanding of Jesus?
Well, I think the most important point they make is that the question of Jesus's nature is far more complex and nuanced than it's often presented, you know?
Right.
There are multiple interpretations, multiple lenses through which to view the evidence, and there are no easy answers.
It's not like they're saying that the traditional Christian view is wrong.
Right.
They're simply presenting kind of like an alternative perspective,
Yeah.
encouraging us to question our assumptions and engage with the material in a critical, thoughtful way.
Exactly. They urge us to consider whether the traditional understanding of Jesus, which, developed over centuries and was shaped by various theological and political forces, whether it might have drifted from his original message.
It's like they're saying, don't just accept what you've been told.
Right.
Do your own research, ask questions, wrestle with the text yourself.
Yeah, and in a world saturated with information, misinformation, and dogma, that kind of critical thinking is more important than ever.
So what does this all mean? I think it means the story of Jesus, even after centuries, it continues to spark debate, it challenges assumptions, and it invites us to grapple with some of life's biggest questions.
And that's a good thing, because these questions, even if they don't have, clear-cut answers, they can lead to a deeper understanding, greater empathy, and a more nuanced appreciation for the complexities of, human belief.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. If Jesus never explicitly claimed divinity, how did that concept become so central to Christianity? What historical, social, or theological forces might have led to this, evolution of belief?
That's a fantastic question, and I encourage all of you to delve into it.
Yeah.
Explore the history, examine the texts, and see where your own journey of understanding leads you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
We'll be back soon with another thought-provoking exploration. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.